Well, I'm a professor. I'm an assistant professor at the
I'll do
city.
the
Sorry.
I'll do the
Sorry.
introduction.
Okay.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United Nations University for Water, Environment, and Health Science Talk series in this our 30th anniversary year. I'm Abraham Nombogo, UNU-INWEH's researcher, WASH, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's Science Talk. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, our Science Talk showcases the diverse, policy-relevant, and interdisciplinary research of UNU-INWEH and our global network of experts. These sessions are designed not only to share cutting-edge science, but also to explore how that science translates into real-world solutions for water, environment, and health challenges around the globe. Today's session, like all of our talks, is being recorded. The video will be made available in an open access format following the event. And you can find recordings of all previous science talks on demand via our website and YouTube channel at unu.edu/inweh/science-talks. As always, we'll conclude with an interactive Q&A session, and please feel free to post your questions in the chat during the presentation. Today's science talk is entitled Using Radiocarbon Analysis to Understand Fossil Carbon in Water Recovery Processes, Implications of Fossil Carbon for IPCC Greenhouse Gas Methodologies. And it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Linda Tseng. Dr. Linda Tseng is an assistant professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at the City College of New York. Her research interests include plastics and microplastics, human exposure to plastic additives, extracellular polymeric substances, fate and transport of emerging contaminants in different water materials, and their removal and quantitative microbial risk assessment in coastal waters. She is currently the co-director of an environmental microplastics team research experiences for undergraduates funded by the National Science Foundations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tseng for today's Science Talk.
Thank you for the introduction. Hi, I'm Professor Tseng, and so I'm going to talk about using chemistry to investigate carbon emissions in the wastewater treatment plants. For the talk, I will use water resource recovery facilities instead of wastewater treatment plants, because we would like to help people understand that wastewater is not a waste. And we want to use water resource recovery facilities to help facilitate that understanding. All right. So in 2026, IPCC had published a guideline for greenhouse gas inventory accounting for everyone. So it's a consistent guideline that everyone can follow. I want to highlight this part. The 2006 IPCC guidelines assume that organic carbon present in wastewater derives from modern, biogenic, organic matter and human excreta or food waste, and are discounted from international greenhouse gas accounting inventories. This means that anything that is in the wastewater, and if you also employ bacteria in your wastewater, it doesn't matter where the wastewater comes from, you're treating it as not fossil carbon. We're treating it as a biogenic carbon. All right, so we would like to challenge that notion that all wastewater is the same. They're all from food waste. So because of this, we want to kind of investigate if it's true. We know that we put on makeup, we use Vaseline, we use all sorts of fossil petroleum-based materials in our life. Vaseline, for example, is completely petroleum-based, and several things, personal care products and pharmaceuticals, may be petroleum-derived. So the carbon inside those products are fossil. Every time we wash ourselves, our hands, take a shower, or use the toilet, everything will go into the wastewater, and we know that everything is mixed in there, and it's not just food. So I know probably everyone knows chemistry, but I would like to review a little bit so then every one of us will be on the same page. How do we trace the carbon? So in the atmosphere, there are cosmic rays that bombard the atmosphere all the time. And the most abundant gas in the atmosphere is nitrogen. Let's say whenever you have cosmic rays, you have extra neutrons in the atmosphere, and then the neutron would have some sort of interaction with the nitrogen in the atmosphere. And from the nitrogen and the neutron interaction, neutron interaction, you would have a reaction that produces carbon-14, which is a radioactive carbon. We call it radiocarbon. And this, you will produce one radiocarbon and then one hydrogen, which is not our focus here, but just know that this is what's happening. And so because this cosmic ray is consistent and the neutron reaction with nitrogen is consistent, carbon-14 in the atmosphere is usually consistent. Concentration is consistent. So how do we then use radiocarbon to our advantage? So radiocarbon is produced in the atmosphere, and it's not from the fossil fuels. So we can distinguish the fossil fuel carbon with the carbon in the atmosphere. So how do we distinguish them? And remember I said radiocarbon is consistent in the atmosphere, and probably in the really, really old times that was also happening. So what happened to the radiocarbon in the petroleum? Radiocarbon is radioactive, and therefore it decays exponentially. The fossil has been in the ground for a really long time, and therefore at the time when we take it out, it's depleted of carbon-14. All right, so most of the things in fossil fuels is just carbon-12, which is the normal carbon that we see. All right, so we have we want to use some metric to help us define how much radiocarbon we're seeing, and we're using this thing called FM, fraction modern. So fraction modern is we use this equation to represent what fraction modern is. We first get a sample of the C14 and C12 ratio, and then we corrected it to we normalized it and corrected it to the fraction from a beetroot sugar from from the time when we say that is the reference from earlier in the chemistry history. And so we use that as a reference, and whatever we get is our fraction modern. How much of the carbon is modern, is not coming from fossil fuels. So C14 decays over time, as I mentioned before. So if plants die, they will stop taking C14 from the atmosphere, and C14 will decrease over time because it's a radioactive carbon. And the half-life of C14 is 5,730 years. And so we can use C14 to date some of the biomass. This is called carbon dating. So fossil fuels have been in the ground for at least 200 million years. So the C14 and the fossil fuels are basically gone, because if you compare the half-life to the years that fossil fuels have been in the ground, it's many half-lives ago. So, which means that C14 is gone completely. And so, if the carbon we can distinguish the carbon. If the carbon emission lacks C14, then we know that it's fossil origin, or we call it anthropogenic. So I just want to show you how we see carbon-14 concentrations in the atmosphere. So fossil fuels it started in 1850s when the Industrial Revolution happened, and our C14 concentration in the atmosphere has been decreasing over time because we're diluting the C14 in the atmosphere with the carbon that we have burned. So in this area, that's when the carbon started to be burned a lot more. And you can see a decrease of the C14 concentration in the atmosphere. And this diluting effect is called the Seuss effect. All right, so pre-industrial revolution, the carbon modern in our atmosphere is about 1. So that's our reference. And fossil fuel burning decreases the fraction modern in the atmosphere slowly because of the diluting, the Seuss effect. And there are other C14 disturbances as well, because we're really smart. We started to use nuclear fission reactors to generate energy as well as weapons. And then this process created a lot of neutrons artificially, and therefore it increases some C14 in the atmosphere. And we did some nuclear weapons testing, and then it generated so much C14 that we actually doubled the C14 concentration in the atmosphere. So the fraction modern went up to 2 instead of 1. And so, but over time, we stopped doing the weapons testing, and natural processes like atmospheric and lands and the ocean, they all have some exchanges together, and then they eventually took C14 away from the atmosphere. And now we're back to fraction modern of 1.02. So this is what fraction modern looked like in the recent, 1950s and on. But what happens is that, so fraction modern, so we have the year 1945 to 2015, about 10 years ago, and then we have our fraction modern numbers here. So before the Industrial Revolution, our fraction modern is about 1, and then when we started to do a lot of weapons testing, these little like bars represent how the frequency of nuclear weapons testing. And when we did a lot of weapons testing, you would see this fraction modern also increase. And you can see that it started at around 1, and then it increased to about 2. And this is what we call the bump spike in the C14 analysis. And so this is just to show you what C14 is like. But over time, the fraction modern decreases due to the fossil fuel use and other exchanges in the atmosphere. And then it's now back to around 1. All right, so our hypothesis is that the water resource recovery facilities treat a lot of different kind of carbons, both modern and fossil, and we'll review a little bit the wastewater facilities, so then you wouldn't understand what it looks like. But wastewater facilities produce sludge as well as water, and wastewater treatment basically removes the stuff in the water and employs the bacteria, and the bacteria will settle down as sludge, and we remove the sludge from the water, and the water will go on as treated wastewater. And so the sludge radiocarbon signature, we think, will be different from the effluent, because we think that in the US, a lot of people grind their food in their sink, and when the food gets ground up, it will go to the wastewater treatment plant, and it's particulate. So the food would be more particulate in the wastewater treatment, and therefore it would settle in the sludge as well. So we think that maybe the sludge radiocarbon is going to be different from what's in the water. And we think also when we use like makeup and pharmaceuticals and personal care products, so a lot of these we wash off our hand, and they're chemical in nature, and they dissolve in the wastewater, and we think that they would stay in the dissolved phase in the water. So we think that the sludge may have a different signature from the water. And we think also maybe different processes would have a different signature. And so because they have different signatures, they would have different fossil carbon emissions. And maybe this could be due to microbial preferences, discrimination of carbon. They may like petroleum carbon more than, for example, radiocarbon. All right. So we study 3 municipal water recovery water resource recovery facilities in Southern California, and so this is a wastewater process. And so Plan 1 is a Lutzig-Ettinger type of water treatment, meaning that you have this influent going in, and then we get all the really large things out by screening and the grid chamber. Primary clarifier sort of removes a lot of suspended things in the water still, and then it will move on to the biological treatment, where we have a denitrification tank, removing a lot of the nitrogen from the dissolved nitrogen to nitrogen gas. And then we will also employ an aeration tank to promote the oxidation of carbon. And that's when we see a lot of carbon. And then we also do secondary clarifier to remove the bacteria now from the water, and the water goes on and the sludge gets processed. Notice that primary clarifier, because it's also removing a lot of the suspended particulates, a lot of the particulates become sludge as well, and they go into solid processing with the secondary clarifier. That's a Lutzig-Ettinger type of plant. But modified Lutzig-Ettinger is when you have a recirculation between the oxic and the anoxic tank. What happens in this is that the plant is trying to remove as much nitrogen as possible, so they have an internal circulation of the water. All right. So in Plant 1 and Plant 2, only we have a energy recovery system using digester to process the sludge, because sludge is mostly organic materials. So if we process and digest it, then we can produce biogas. Then we can burn it as a way to recover energy. And then we will also produce a byproduct called biosolids, and that can be used for soil amendments in farms. Of course, it's currently a little controversial because other things in the biosolids, but we will not talk about that. All right, so how do we analyze the samples? When I was at UC Irvine doing this analysis, we used the Keck carbon cycle accelerator mass spectrometry, AMS laboratory there. And all the liquid and the solid samples are dried in the oven at low temperature or freeze-dried. And if you have not seen freeze-dried wastewater sludge before, you can see it now. This is just powders of sludge. So the samples are then combusted to carbon dioxide, and then carbon dioxide is then graphitized. Okay, so from there, we would get sample fraction modern. So then how do we tell what kind of sources contributed to the fraction modern in the sample? So we know the background fraction modern. We know the fraction modern of the background, and we don't know what percentage it's contributing. So we're gonna call it this fraction that is this percentage is contributing is X background. We also know that there is some sort of fossil contribution to the sample. And we know the FM, the fraction modern of fossil is, I know in your head you're shouting that fraction modern of the fossil is 0. Okay, good. So then we know the fraction modern of the fossil contribution is 0. Then this whole term at the end is completely canceled. Then we can just solve for the X background, and then we can do 1 minus the X background to find out how much fossil carbon is in the sample. All right. So this is basically how we calculate the fossil contribution. Then from the fossil contribution, we also need to know the carbon dioxide equivalent emission from the wastewater. So a lot of the carbon dioxide is coming from this thing called the volatile suspended solids in the secondary treatment. So volatile suspended solids are basically bacteria that we then eventually will like turn into, in an ideal situation, will turn into carbon dioxide or methane. But in this case, we are turning everything into carbon dioxide equivalent. So then we're basically turning the methane into carbon dioxide equivalent with this with these carbon dioxide equation. So the volatile suspended solids in the wastewater is a concentration. The organic matter in water is a kilogram, like a mass per volume type of concentration. And then we basically said under ideal situation, all of the carbon will be turned into carbon dioxide. And this is how much carbon could be contributed with this amount of water treated. So we have a mass over volume, mass of carbon dioxide over volume emission of carbon dioxide from the secondary treatment. And then because large facilities produce more carbon dioxide and small facilities produce less carbon dioxide, we need to find a way to normalize the plant in some way. And this is how we normalized it. We normalized it by the wastewater treatment rates. So basically, we know how much the plant is treating per day. Then we also know the volatile suspended solid generation per day, because we know how much it's treating, how much it's generating by looking at the sludge. And then from there, we can then apply this carbon dioxide emission potential to the equation. Then we will get carbon dioxide of carbon dioxide mass generated, carbon dioxide equivalent mass generated per wastewater treated, per volume of wastewater treated. And that way we will normalize all the treatment plants in how much water they treated. So per volume of water treated, carbon dioxide emission per volume treated. All right, so now we're gonna go into results. Before I go into the results, I want to kind of explain to you what the X and the Y axis is. The X axis is our fossil contribution. Again, this is the thing that we calculated in the like 2-3 slides back. And carbon dioxide emission potential, this is the thing that we just calculated from the previous slide. And this is, you know, per volume treated, wastewater treated. Now, if fossil contribution is 0, there's no fossil contribution to the sample, then it would be just the background. But if there is more fossil contribution, then you will have a positive value. And we have 3 treatment plants, but why do the green ones, the plant 1, have so much negative values? So what this means is that it has a much higher C14 than the background. And what we found out is that there are many things. So plant 1 receives wastewater from hospitals, from a chemical synthesizing factory, I guess. And this place actually manufactures isotopic labeled chemicals. And the hospitals, sometimes they release a lot of radioactive materials due to chemotherapy. And because we don't know how much they're contributing per day, and we also don't know what the concentration of C14 in their raw wastewater is, we cannot back calculate what is actually coming from the household and what is coming from the hospital, what is coming from the factory. And so in this case, we found that plant 1 has elevated C14, and we cannot use our equation to solve this fossil contribution. And so we cannot use the fossil fraction model calculation. And therefore, we, from now on, will only talk about plant 2 and 3. I mind you, every sample here is about $200 to analyze. So we have spent a lot of money on the samples that are high in C14, which is a shame, but we move on. So plant 1, as we said, that it has a lot of C14 in the sample, and actually from the C14 and using carbon dating, we know that it's coming from the future. The age is negative age, 200, 300 years in the future, so we cannot use it. We're gonna be focusing on plant 2 and 3. From the raw sludge sample, raw influent wastewater sample, we know that the C14 age from plant 2 and 3 are is at least 300 years old to 400 years old, and then even as old as 2,000 years old. We know that if, let's say, we use the toilet that morning, we didn't use the toilet 2,000 years ago. So how did the age of the sludge, the influent water, get to be 2,000 years old? You know, I wanted to make a joke that I took a picture in the Smithsonian that there's a fossil feces, but we did not make this, you know. So what happens must be that the fossil contribution comes from the things that we use in our daily life that becomes the influent of the wastewater treatment plant. All right, so moving on, we want to just kind of tell you what we did. So we have our primary influent, that's where we sample. We sampled the primary sludge, the food particulates we think, or anything that's suspended in the water, are removed in the primary clarifier, becoming the sludge. The primary effluents going into the biological treatment. This is the secondary treatment. We took some samples of the mixed liquor, both the water and the sludge, and then we also took some samples of the off gas. We took some sample of the secondary sludge, and then we took some sample of the secondary effluent. And then we also took some sample from the digester, the biogas and the biosolids. That way we can account what is really being produced as a carbon product from there. All right. So I'm gonna use these abbreviations for different kinds of samples. So we have PIPS, PE, and then ML, and then we have SS and then SE. All right, so this is the part where I'm going to focus on only plant 2 and 3. Again, this is the background, zero fossil contribution is the background. And we also have carbon equivalent emission potential here. So from here, we're going from the beginning, from the influence. The influence of the water could be similar to the background, meaning that there's no more fossil carbon addition, or it can be as much as more than a quarter of the carbon coming from fossil sources. And so it's beyond 0.25, it's almost 0.3. So because of this, we know for sure there is fossil contribution. So we know 0.28%, 0 to 28% of the carbon content is coming from fossil. And so we know wastewater has fossil carbon. Then we go to the next step, which is the primary sludge and primary effluent. So primary sludge and the primary effluent, they both are a little bit higher in the fossil contribution, and but I want to note that the sludge is a lot more closer to the background than the primary effluent, which is mainly just water. Sludge is mainly just the content we removed in the clarifier, the things that are suspended in the influent. And we know that because of this, because they're different, the primary sludge was more modern than primary effluent. We think that our hypothesis was kind of in this way correct, because food particulates in California wastewater, because we allow food grinders in the sink, that food particulates settle as sludge, and therefore become their food is more modern than what's in the water, and therefore we think that the dissolved fossil carbons are mostly in the water phase rather than the sludge. All right, so then the fossil carbon then moves on to, with the fossil carbon in the primary effluent, then moves on to the secondary treatment. So the secondary treatment, we go to the mixed liquor, where both the water and the sludge the bacteria is mixing, and then we remove the sludge from the water, and we only look at the sludge. Here, I want to note that this is more obvious than other samples, that mixed liquor is both water and bacteria. Suspended solids is mostly the bacteria that we remove. I want to say that because it's more carbonaceous, our carbon dioxide equivalent is also a lot higher than the mixed liquor. And because we know that the suspended solids had higher carbon content, in fact, the highest samples we have seen, suspended solids potentially could emit up to, in this calculation, 0.38 kilogram of the fossil carbon per cubic meter of water treated. And we did this calculation by multiplying this number, carbon dioxide that would be emitted into the atmosphere, times the fraction of the carbon that would be fossil. We did this multiplication, and then we come up with this number. All right, so going on, we go to the secondary effluent. In this case, we removed a lot of the solids that's in the water, and it's mainly just water, very treated water. And in this case, we see the fossil contribution that's still remaining in the water could be as high as almost 50% of the carbon that's left over. But again, this is mainly just water now, but a lot of things that we cannot remove from the water remains in the water, and those carbons seem to be more fossil than normal. And even though the fossil contribution is very high, if we calculate the carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, this low emission times the fossil contribution, we still get a really, really low carbon emissions from this because the carbon equivalent carbon dioxide emission is low, and if we multiply something low to 0.4 or 5, we would still get a really, really low carbon emissions number. All right. Think about that number, 0.01, and then our previous number was 0.38. All right. So then let's see, we start from the beginning. Primary influent, primary sludge, primary effluent, mixed liquor, secondary solids, secondary sludge, sorry, and then secondary effluent. If we trace this, we see kind of a shift of the points. So we see that different processes may actually lead to different fossil content due to the nature of the processes. And so let's delve into that a little more. If we circle the primary primary samples here, primary treatment samples here, and we circle all the secondary treatment samples here, what happens is that the primary samples are a little more modern than the secondary samples. And this means that whatever is left over in the water from the primary effluent, it would drive the age of the sludge in the secondary treatment. So you can see the PE is here, primary effluent, primary effluent, primary effluent, and then nothing in the secondary treatment is more modern than the primary effluent. All right. So then let's get into the really interesting stuff. If we calculated everything that a water resource recovery facility is producing, calculate their carbon dioxide equivalent emissions from just the methane and nitrous oxide, which are actually part of the IPCC framework in 2006. And then if we don't include the fossil carbon dioxide, which is about, the carbon dioxide that's actually emitted by the treatment plant, we found that it's about 7.2% fossil. If we don't include that, the IPCC carbon dioxide equivalent would be this much. But if we included the fossil carbon dioxide, it would actually increase the number by 23%. If they have an energy recovery system on site, the digesters. If they do not have that digester on site, we'll only see about 13% increase. But nonetheless, this is not a trivial number, and I think that we should really consider including it. So we published our paper on this, and we think that maybe there's a way that maybe the facilities may consider carbon sequestration to remove the fossil carbon in their water and in their facility. Our facilities that we investigated we know that they receive up to 28% fossil carbon from municipal wastewater. And we also think that the primary influent and primary sludge difference is due to the food particulates settling, making the primary effluent a little more older because it has more fossil content. And we think that also different wastewater processes had different radiocarbon signatures due to different different treatment processes. And we think also that the physical chemical nature of the carbon in the wastewater would be able to help would drive the selection process in the wastewater, and therefore we would see different age in different processes. We think that maybe whatever carbon is left over in the secondary effluent, that's the very, very old carbon that's almost half of the carbon that is from fossil. We think that because we synthesize a lot of the chemicals from petroleum, and these are the chemicals that microbes have the hardest time with to degrade it, and therefore it's left in the water, and therefore maybe microbes prefer like an easier carbon over complex carbon, or maybe microbes prefer C14 over C12 in this case. We're not sure what's happening. So we published our result in 2016, and the IPCC guideline has been kind of, in a way, being kind of revised a little bit. So now from here, in 2019, they said research published since 2006 gives an emerging consensus figure for all fossil wastewater organic carbon fraction at some 4 to 14%, although more recent work suggests this can be as high as 28% or 51% in some influence. And 28%, this number was coming from our study. In fact, they cited our study in the more recent guidelines. All right, so you think this is over, but we also did a lot more. We also took samples from the groundwater, from the tap water, from domestic sewage. We have it all from the wastewater treatment plants, and we have the biogas, we have the biosolids, and we have their fossil contributions. We think that maybe this will help future carbon dioxide emissions modeler put it more into perspective in where the water comes from, how the age is different, and how we have different fossil contributions and carbon dioxide content in the water. And we also want to show that not all the wastewater is the same. In the guideline, they did not specify what kind of wastewater should be accounted for under that guideline. But the thing is that all the wastewater treatment plants use the same guidelines. And petroleum refinery wastewater is also treated with biological organisms before they discharge it to the environment. And what happens is that we actually got samples from petroleum chemical refinery plants, and we can see that this is our background. This is no fossil contamination, and then we have one that's completely fossil. This means that wastewaters are not the same, and petroleum chemical plants should do their accounting separate from the domestic wastewater. And so this is what we think we should, think about when we just use the guidelines as is. And not all the treatments are the same. This is a sample from Australia. We went to a treatment, we went to like a settling pond. And what happens is that the wastewater would go into a pond and then gets, treated in the pond, just letting it naturally treat with natural bacteria and natural settling of particulates. And when we take some samples from the pond and influent sample, influent sludge, effluent sludge, we didn't see a difference between all the samples, among all the samples in fossil contribution, meaning that not all the treatments are the same, not all the wastewater are the same. All right, so with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. We received the PIRE from NSF to go to Australia. We want to thank all the personnel helping us taking the sample. I got a fellowship at the time to do my graduate studies, and Professor Ogunsei Tan kind of help us freeze dry the samples we have. And with that, thank you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tseng, for this really insightful presentation. We will now start our Q&A session. And for those of you online, you can post your questions in the chat, and I will read them to Dr. Tseng for her response. So I'll start by...
Sorry.
I'll start by asking you this question.
Yeah.
So what are the most immediate policy implications after you've recognized fossil carbon emission from wastewater treatment?
So the most important implication is that if we use the guideline from 2006, all the wastewaters are treated the same way, and therefore we will underestimate the carbon emissions because all the wastewater is treated as modern and not fossil. And our study showed that it does have fossil carbons in the wastewater. And therefore, that's why we published the study showing that we have to account for the fossil carbons in the wastewater. It's not trivial.
Okay, so now if we rethink wastewater treatment plants as part of the carbon cycle rather than just sanitation infrastructure, how does that change the way we design and regulate them?
If you mean if we were to implement if we were to, yeah.
Maybe if we were to rethink wastewater treatment plants as part of carbon cycle rather than just sanitation infrastructure, because you identified carbon or fossil carbons in wastewater treatment. So how would that change how we design and regulate them?
I see. All right, so I think that wastewater treatment receives a lot of domestic carbons, and we use water all the time. We produce wastewater all the time, and part of the cycle is that if the carbon is not treated, it will go into the environment, and therefore if we have to include the carbon, if we were to include the wastewater carbon in the carbon cycle, we will see a lot more contribution of the carbon that's fossil, that's emitted into the atmosphere, and that we're currently undercounting them. And that is what I feel like drives the carbon cycle, help us understand the carbon dioxide emissions. And that's what, if we don't account for the carbons in the wastewater, what happens is that we will just think that the carbon is coming from somewhere. And it's not wastewater. And I think that it would just help us account for carbon dioxide a lot better. I don't know if this answers your question.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, Rohit.
Thank you so much, Linda, for a really fantastic presentation. Really great to see, the research coming out of our UNU hub at CCNY. I was just wondering, it's kind of building on Abraham's question. I'm just wondering if a lot of these carbon inputs, fossil carbon inputs are coming in from upstream, from industry, from households, etc.
Yep.
From an intervention point of view, right? So from a regulatory policy intervention point of view, where is our best opportunity for intervention? Is it at those upstream points, where those kind of carbon those influents are coming from, or is it at the recovery plant level?
Yeah. So I have two parts to this. So first, we really have to, regulatory wise, if we were to ever use carbon credits, implement carbon credits, we really have to separate wastewater treatments to different categories. Domestic wastewater treatment, chemical treatment, paper mill treatment, all separate, right? So that's the first step. Second step is that if we were to really account for carbon dioxide, in fact, I did this for the entire, I did this as an exercise in my class, how much carbon would be actually generated from all the wastewater treatment plants, domestic wastewater treatment plants in the country. That's only for domestic wastewater. And it accounted actually less than 1% of the carbon dioxide that's produced by the US. And therefore, I think you're right. We should go think about upstream, but upstream is more like separating the wastewater treatments from each other. And right now, if we are only looking at domestic wastewater, we cannot account the wastewater carbon dioxide completely because we treat all the wastewaters the same. And so regulatory wise, I think that we should separate them. And also, if we were to separate them, then the things that are coming into the domestic wastewater will actually be very, very small. But I think it would be so it's less than 1% of all the US, but it's a huge percentage for a wastewater treatment because it increases the wastewater treatment carbon dioxide to 13 to 24%, 23%. And so that's actually substantial for them. But in a country by country basis, it's a very small percentage. So yeah, I think that we also cannot, this is also what came out from the study when IPCC was, they were meeting together and making the revision of the guidelines. One of the things was like, well, wastewater did not make these fossil carbons. Why are we taxed with, this amount, because we cannot control what's coming in, right? So I think that the regulators also have to be careful when we use carbon credits. That's a short that's the short and the yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, we have a question from Zulekha Tieno Khan, and she wants to know. Yes, so she is representing International Coalition of New Diplomats, a youth-led organization, and she wants to know, given the financial and technological barriers faced by many developing countries, what steps can be taken to make radiocarbon analysis more accessible for wastewater monitoring and greenhouse gas accounting?
That's a very good question. As I mentioned that the each of the samples that you see on the graph took $200 to do, and there are only a couple of really precise AMS, accelerated mass spectrometer, around the world to do the carbon dating analysis. I think that if we were serious and I have talked over the years with many colleagues about this, if we were to be serious about this, we would, for example, have samples, representative samples sent to a facility and do this once every 10 years or something like that to check their facility. And it cannot be the burden of the facilities to do this. And I think that it may also be not a burden of the country to do this, because I feel like if IPCC made this guideline and the countries have to abide by the guideline, and just letting you know that the guideline is just a guideline, and our studies was included as a recommendation to do it, but they're not asking everyone to do that in radiocarbon analysis in their accounting. So basically, I think that a systematic effort has to be made globally for this kind of measurements to be available for everyone. And so whether it's realistic or not, that's what I believe.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Thank you, Linda, for your presentation. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
My question is about, first of all, I would like to thank you for revealing the hidden portion of fossil fuel contribution in wastewater. But in your further analysis, if I understood well, in water resources, you mentioned that you detected a portion in groundwater. Am I right?
Yes.
What do you think the pathway, how this happened?
All right. So thank you. That's a good question. So we initially wanted to take the groundwater sample to understand where the fossil carbons come from, just to eliminate them. And we realized that by the time the groundwater has been treated and then go into the tap, the fossil carbon in the water has been lost. And the tap water actually is a lot more modern, because in the water treatment facilities, what happens is that they also do sedimentation, and the sedimentation take a lot of the carbon out of the system, and therefore we cannot use that as a legitimate way to say, well, that's where carbon contribution, the fossil carbon contribution comes from the groundwater. In terms of whether it's a huge problem that the groundwater has a lot more fossil carbon, I would say no, because I think that the groundwater has actually very low carbon content, even though we can detect the carbon fractions, the different radiocarbon fractions. the carbon content is very, very low. We had to dry the groundwater several times with several volumes to actually get enough carbon to be analyzed. So I think that the groundwater should not be a concern. Is that what your question was?
Thank you.
Thank you very much once again, Dr. Shen, for this thought-provoking talk. And thanks to everyone for the engaging discussion. This brings us to the end of today's UNU-INWEH Science Talk. And if you enjoyed this session, remember that all our previous talks are available on our website and YouTube channel at unu.edu/INWEH/science-talks. And feel free to revisit or share them with your colleagues. And we'll be here next week, Wednesday, for another inspiring talk. Thank you, Dr. Chen, once again.
Thank
It's
you.
nice having
Thank
you.
you. Nice meeting all of you.